Hello, I hope you find this story interesting. Your feedback, suggestions, and subscriptions are always welcome. Frank Douglas worked all his life, saving for a comfortable retirement. He dreamed of traveling and enjoying life without worrying about bills. But one proposal changed everything. Instead of a carefree old age, he got debt, fear, and betrayal. Frank was sitting in his favorite cafe, enjoying his morning coffee, when his old friend, Paul Anderson, sat down. Frank, old friend. Paul smiled. How are you? They hadn't seen each other for several years, but Paul looked much better than Frank remembered. An expensive suit, an expensive watch, a winner's smile. I can't complain, Frank replied. And you seem to be doing well. And yes, and I want to share a secret with you. Frank was wary. What is it? Paul leaned closer. There is an investment project, guaranteed profit, minimal risks. I've already invested and I'm getting serious money. Frank sighed. No, Paul, I don't like to take risks. This isn't a risk, man. It's an opportunity. Paul took out his phone and opened the banking app. Look. Frank saw tens of thousands of dollars flashing in Paul's account. That's all in a few months. Paul winked. Frank didn't know what to say. It was too good to be true. But his doubts had already begun to dissolve. A week later, Frank went to meet with his investment advisor. He was greeted by a young man in impeccable suit. Mr. Douglas, nice to meet you. You made the right choice. Frank listened to the presentation, the charts, the figures. Everything looked perfect. But he felt a little hesitant. But when the advisor handed over the documents, his hand took the pen, and he signed. Frank thought he was investing in his future. But in reality, he was signing the death warrant for his quiet life. Frank Douglas was a smart man. He was always careful with his money, never chasing a quick buck. But this time he was sold a dream, and he didn't realize how he had fallen into the trap. And after signing the documents, Frank was invited to a meeting with the company's chief investment advisor, James Reeves. James looked like a man you could trust, fit, confident, with impeccable manners. Mr. Douglas, you've made the right choice, he smiled. Your pension will work for you. Frank was a little nervous. And the risks? James leaned forward. All investments have some risk, but in our case it's minimal. Are you sure? Absolutely. Let me show you how our system works. James turned on the screen. Frank was presented with charts, reports, and feedback from other investors. Everything looked extremely professional. See these numbers. That's a steady increase in our assets. We work with the best companies, no dubious schemes. Frank looked at the numbers. Everything looked logical. But most importantly, he saw that people were already making money. James spoke confidently, easily, almost friendly. Your friend Paul is already making a profit, right? Yes. And he trusted us with his money. Why? Because he knows it's safe here. Frank nodded. It all sounded too good to be true. But if it works, why not try it? How much are you willing to invest? James asked. Frank thought about it. He had $400,000 in his retirement account. Let's start with $50,000, he finally said. James just smiled. You won't regret it, Mr. Douglas. Frank signed the check. He didn't even realize that he had just put his money in the wrong hands forever. He believed he had made the right choice. But the truth was quite different. Fraud always starts the same way. First, they give you a taste of profit, and then they take everything. Little did Frank Douglas know that he was already on the edge of a cliff. A month after investing, Frank received his first payout. He received $3,000 to his account, and he couldn't believe his eyes. It was working. He even received a profitability report signed by James Reeves. Everything looked fair and transparent. But that was only part of the game. The next month, he received another $4,000. A phone call from James. Mr. Douglas, we are seeing great results. Should we increase our investment? Frank thought about it. If it brings such a profit, why not invest more? A week later, he transferred another $1,000 to the company, and that's when things started to change. Another month passed, but there were no payments. Frank tried to call the company. It's a temporary difficulty, James replied. The financial markets are a little unstable, but everything is under control. Frank calmed down, but there was an inexplicable uneasiness inside him. A month later, he called again. This time, no one answered. Frank tried to access the company's website. The page wouldn't open. So he dialed Paul. Hey, did you get the payout? No. Something's going on. Frank felt his throat go dry. Something was wrong. But he didn't know how badly. Frank's money was gone. There was only one question. Was it gone forever, or was there something else that could be done? Losing money is always a blow. But it is even worse to realize that you have been deliberately deceived. Frank Douglas had avoided risky decisions all his life, and now he was left with nothing. Frank tried to access the company's website again. The page was not found. His heart was racing. He called James Reeves. The subscriber was unavailable. Company office. The number no longer existed. He called Paul. Do you know what's going on? They're gone, Frank. The office is empty. Frank clutched his head. This wasn't a mistake. It was a scam. He drove to the building where the company used to be. An empty room. No furniture, no documents. It was as if no one had ever been there. Frank felt his hands tremble. They were gone. And with them his life savings. The next morning he filed a police report. The officer listened carefully and sighed. You are not the first, Mr. Douglas. This company is a fraud, and they have covered their tracks well. But there is something you can do, right? The officer shook his head. We've opened a case, but there's almost no chance of finding them. Frank couldn't believe it. All his life he had worked, saved, and done the right thing, and now he was just told to forget it. But he wasn't going to forget. He was going to find these people. And if the law does not help, he will do it in his own way. One day you wake up and realize that everything you've been building your whole life is gone. Your money, your security, your trust in people. Frank Douglas knew that he had only two options. Accept it, or take action. Frank checked his bank account again. The balance was $32. He closed his eyes. How had this happened? A month ago, he had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life, and now he didn't know how he was going to pay the next month's rent. Paul had lost money too, but Frank suspected that his losses were smaller. They left us, Frank, Paul said over the phone. We have no chance of finding them. Or we don't have a chance, or you don't want to take the risk. Paul stopped talking. I don't want to get involved anymore. You got me into this scam, and I'm sorry. But what can I do? Should I start looking for answers? Frank, they're gone. Forget it, it's ringing. Frank threw the phone away. His fingers trembled with anger. He would not accept this. Frank sat down at his laptop. He had to find something about this company. Names, documents, mentions in the news. Or at least one of these people. He entered James Reeves' Investments into the search, and he saw something that made him feel cold. James Reeves had done this before. The question is, where is he now and how can we find him? Frank Douglas could have resigned himself. He could have simply accepted his defeat, as the other victims did. But instead, he decided to hunt. And if the law doesn't help, he'll find the crooks himself. An online search yielded the first result. James Reeves was featured in old articles about financial fraud. But then he used a different name, Jason Randolph. Frank felt a chill run through his body. He hadn't just stumbled upon scammers. He was trapped by professionals. He started looking for other people who had invested in the same scam. He found a small group on a forum. Dozens of pensioners, like him, were left with nothing. But most of them had already given up. Only one person agreed to meet. "My name is Alex Harris. I also want to get what's mine back." Alex was a former accountant. Had brought documents that he had been collecting for months. "I found something interesting, Frank." He put a sheet of paper in front of him. "A new investment company. New name. But the same faces. They're working again." Frank whispered. Alex nodded. "And we know where to find them. They've got their first real lead. The question is, what do we do next? When you lose money, it's bad enough. But when debt collectors come knocking on your door, it gets even worse." Frank Douglas thought that the scammers had already taken everything from him. But it turned out that he still had something to lose. The phone rang early in the morning. "Mr. Douglas, the Financial Control Agency is calling you. What do you owe a debt to our client?" Frank's brow furrowed. "I don't owe anyone anything. Your investment was made through a line of credit, and now the bank is demanding a refund." Frank got cold feet. "But it was my own cash." "Your contract called for collateral." Frank felt his hands shake. "They want to take his house." Frank immediately went to the bank. "This is a mistake," he told the manager. He just shrugged his shoulders. "Mr. Douglas, you signed the documents. I signed a contract for investment, not debt. But your money went through an affiliated financial group, and now we can't get it back. What does this mean?" The manager looked at him seriously. "If you don't repay the debt, the bank will confiscate your real estate." In the evening, Frank heard a knock at the door. 2 men in suits stood on the doorstep. "Mr. Douglas." "Yes. We're here to remind you about the debt. I'm still dealing with the bank. You have 3 weeks. If you don't pay, you'll lose everything." Frank looked them in the eye. And he realized that these people were not just bank employees. He had lost one battle. But he wouldn't give them his last possessions without a Frank Douglas had already lost his life savings. But he was holding on to the last thing he had left at his home. He believed that as long as he had a roof over his head, he could still fight. But the debt collectors thought otherwise. The early morning knock on the door made Frank jump, though he already knew who it was. The 2 men in dark suits stood on the doorstep again. "Your time is up, Mr. Douglas," one of them said. I'm trying to settle a matter with the bank." You're not going to solve anything. The appraisal committee will be here in 2 days." Frank felt his throat tighten. "You can't just take my house, or we can do anything." They turned and left, leaving him in complete silence. He had exactly 48 hours left. Frank called the bank. "You do realize I've just been robbed, right? Mr. Douglas, we are not responsible for your personal financial decisions." "But this is fraud." "You should file a police report." He laughed. Bitterly, "The police. They have already told him that they will do nothing. The bank will not help. There is no law, and now he didn't even have anyone to call." He called his daughter. "Dad, what now?" "I'm losing the house, Amy." A few seconds of silence. "And I told you not to get involved in these adventures." "I didn't think I'd be fooled." You never thought," she said, her voice without sympathy. Frank closed his eyes. "I'm not asking for money. Just tell me you're here." Dad, I'm busy." The phone rang. His own daughter didn't want to hear any more. Frank sat down in his favorite chair. This house was his life. This was where his children grew up. It was where he celebrated Christmas with his wife while she was alive. And tomorrow other people will come here, and his past would simply disappear. He clenched his fists. No, it wasn't over yet. They thought he was going to give up. But Frank Douglas was going to prove he hadn't said the last word. When you have lost everything, fear disappears. You're no longer afraid of debt collectors, banks, or the police. And you're only afraid of being left with nothing and just giving up. Frank Douglas had nothing, but he had one last chance. Frank flipped through all the documents he had found with Alex Harris. He found a connection between the fraudsters' old companies and the new financial structures. The fraudsters were repeating their schemes under new names. This meant only one thing: they were back in town. The new office was located in a prestigious business center. Frank stood in front of the glass entrance, clutching the evidence folder. He could simply hand it over to the police, or he could play it his way. He entered the building, the reception desk. The receptionist looked at him carefully. "Are you here for an appointment?" Yes, I need to speak to James Reeves." "I'm sorry, but he's busy." "Tell him that Frank Douglas won't leave until he's finished talking." A minute later, James came out into the hallway. The same expensive suit, the same confidence. He looked at Frank and smiled. "Oh, well, look at that. You're still here." Frank came closer. "I know you're still up to your scam." James didn't bat an eye. So what? I can give it to the police." James sighed. "Or you do realize that won't change anything, right? We'll see." He handed him the folder. James flipped through the pages and then looked up. Or do you want another option?" Frank clenched his fists. He had just been made an offer. What now? Fight to the end or take the deal? Frank had a few seconds to decide. Some things can't be bought. But sometimes silence pays more than the truth. Frank Douglas had a choicing: accept the money or punish the crooks. James Reeves calmly closed the evidence folder. Let's be honest, Mr. Douglas. Do you want justice? Or do you want your money back?" Frank tensed. "I want you to answer for what you've done." James smiled. "No one is responsible for anything, old man. But you can have your deposit back, and a little more." He slowly pulled out his checkbook. $150,000. "The money will be transferred to your account right now." Frank felt his heart flutter. He could get his life back. But at what cost? Frank thought of the people who had been cheated. He remembered his empty chair in the house that he no longer had. He remembered how his daughter had turned away. How the police had said, "You can't prove anything." He looked at James. "What if I refuse?" James shrugged his shoulders. "Then you'll lose everything." Frank slowly took the pen. He took a deep breath. He put the pen back down. "I'm not selling my dignity." James shook his head. "Stupid choice, man." "It's my choice." Frank turned and walked out. He had a big battle ahead of him. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing the right thing. He turned down the money. But did that mean he had won? Or did he just doom himself to defeat? Frank Douglas gave up the money. He chose to fight rather than compromise. But does that mean he won? Frank walked out of the crook's office, leaving James Reeves annoyed but not afraid. He could have been killed. They could have destroyed him completely. But it didn't happen. Why? Because James was too sure that he would not be punished? And Frank decided to prove otherwise. The next morning, he handed over all the documents to journalists. The investigation of the fraudulent scheme began at the national level. The police, who had previously ignored the case, could no longer remain silent. 2 weeks later, James' office was closed and his accounts frozen. But James' self was no longer in town. Frank was sitting in a cheap motel watching the news. His case had gotten publicity, but his money was still lost. The bank owned his house. His daughter never called him again. Had he won? Or had he just lost everything to prove his point? Frank had destroyed a fraudulent scheme, but will he get his own life back? Or is this just the beginning of another story? What would you do if you were Frank? Should you trust guaranteed investments? Write in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.